International Peace Studies, Soka University, Japan. Ms. Natasha Chiswa, lecturer, Jindal Global Law School. And moderating this session is Professor C. Raj Kumar, who is the Vice Chancellor of the OP Jindal Global University. A big round of applause for them, please.
All right, very good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I would like to take this moment to congratulate NewsX and Kartikeya Sharma for this fantastic launch, where we saw a global news channel being launched from India. I echo the sentiments of the Honorable Prime Minister and all of us here that this is a very defining moment for Indian media to have gone global and to be able to link the issues that affect India and the world at large by providing thought leadership. Today we have truly a global panel. We have one distinguished American judge, we have one distinguished international lawyer, and we have an outstanding academic from South Africa, somewhat representing the global south. So let me quickly introduce them. We have Professor Vesselin Popovski, who is a professor at Jindal Global Law School, but also had a long career at the United Nations as an international lawyer. We have Natasha Chiswa, who's a professor also in the law school, but also from South Africa, pursued her law degrees in South Africa. And then we have Justice Michael Wilson, who is right now teaching at Jindal Global Law School, but has had a very distinguished career as a judge of the Supreme Court of Hawaii. The theme of this particular panel is essentially the larger theme of what we have been discussing since yesterday, which is about what's next in the theme that we're discussing. And we are going to debate and discuss about what's next in law. Now, of course, the organizers have truncated this time for us. We barely have 20 minutes. But then, you know, to have lawyers speak for 20 minutes without charging is already a good deal. So we have unbillable hours by these law professors with us. So I'm going to start with Vesselin. Vesselin, we know that the world of law has dramatically changed, especially the last 2 decades. When we were at law school, the idea of domestic law and international law were almost 2 different worlds. People who learn domestic law, they are largely confined to national jurisdictions. And then there are people who practice something called international law, which is so far away from what's happening in the respective countries. Now, with today's issues that we are discussing, be it the technological advancements that has led to artificial intelligence and robotics and machine learning, or for that matter, climate change, which has impacted and continuously impacting the world at large, or what we heard from our physics professor, the evolution of quantum computing and space explorations and things that are no longer having jurisdictional barriers that lawyers are so much, let's say, used to. How do you see the very idea of next in law? In a way, my question to you is that, how do we prepare ourselves to be ready for what's the next big thing in law?
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. You mentioned 2 of the biggest challenges that the world, and not only the law, but every part of governance. This is the climate change and artificial intelligence. And both of them affect dramatically domestic law and international law, as I say. Let me just say that yesterday I checked, and there are more than 3,000 successful litigation of citizens and NGOs, Greenpeace, against government for governmental failure to meet the mitigation of CO2 emissions. You know, 25 years ago, this was absolutely unthinkable. Well, normally judges are conservative people. Well, we'll have an exception here, Michael, who is a very progressive judge. But normally judges try to operate within the certainty, consistency, repetitiveness, and something like what will happen in 15 to 20 years, with how much the temperature will rise, what effect that will affect, is not something that impresses the judges. But in all 3,000 litigations, based on human rights applications filed by citizens. We have judges filing successful applications by citizens challenging governments for not meeting the standards of mitigation of CO2. Now, the other question is, what does it mean generally? Do governments follow that? And here comes the next point, which is that if the judiciary does the work, then the governments, we hope, will also follow up. And in fact, this morning, we saw an excellent, charismatic, modern prime minister. I wish more leaders in the world followed the same modernity and the same charisma and innovations which India offers now. In fact, India does very well in most of the Sustainable Development Goals, in most of the innovations and application of science. And the second issue, the second challenge, the artificial intelligence, that will also have a dramatic effect, again, not only in the legal profession, but also on many other professions. Here we have already the problem of missing regulations. Only yesterday, again, the European Union AI Act, it's an act which classifies 3 types of risk. Unacceptable risk, things that needs to be totally prohibited. For example, such as social profiling, such as utilizing AI to establish vulnerabilities of some people. The second type of risk are the high risk. These are basically automatic cars, automatic airplanes, medical devices. Here we don't have a prohibition, but we can have some safeguards and some control and monitoring. And the minimal level of risks, as we saw earlier today, those deepfake videos where transparency and announcing that AI create that context will be enough too. So European Union adopted that act, but we see again inconsistency and not very clear what that will mean.
Thank you.
But there are efforts to regulate also the AI.
Thank you very much, Vesselin, for that. And I think that's one of the difficult spaces in which law will constantly operate with regard to the changing policy dimensions and, let's say, internal pressures within countries. Natasha, one of the things that will be very curious for all of us, especially in Global South, is that most of international law is actually made by the developed countries. And we are pretty much coming late to the party. And that means the rules and regulations are already set. The companies and corporations which are out there in the West determine the framework, and we are asked to follow it. Now, how do we in Global South, especially, let's say, BRICS, for example, where South Africa, where you are from, also, how do we respond to it? And how can we assume a leadership role, especially when some of the important technological innovations have its origins in the kind of thought leadership, let's say, a country like India is providing?
Thank you for the question. So first of all, looking that we're coming from the Global South, we need to strengthen and have robust, sound laws. When we have these laws, we also need to strengthen our domestic laws so that when we are having cooperation, irrespective of where they are coming from, our laws protect us from human rights violations. So for example, when you are looking at AI system, when you are looking at the rise of digital platform labor platforms, the reason why we are facing so many violations is because sometimes our legal systems are weak. So it is up to us right now to strengthen enforcement mechanism, to expand our definitions, and also to ensure that there are strict penalties for failing to comply with our domestic laws. Therefore, I think with this, we will be able to proceed forward.
Thank you, Natasha. I think that's a very important point you're making, especially because we simply cannot assume leadership role globally if we don't set our house in order. And that means to re-examine our legal and regulatory architecture and to see how we are aligned with some of these big issues that we're discussing. Mike, you've been a distinguished judge, spent a lifetime focusing on issues relating to environment and climate change. My question to you is that, to what extent you are concerned about the changing role of judiciary in being asked to adjudicate matters that they are not historically trained to. Let me explain what I mean. Now, judiciary, not just in this country, but all over the world, even in the United States, judges are usually trained to understand when the law is very clear, the consequence is very clear, there is a clear, recognition of a right or not, and you are better off to adjudicate. The moment when you enter into areas where the technology is evolving, the change is not immediately predictable, such as climate, how do you expect judges to adjudicate? And what are the principles and values that the judges ought to keep in mind when they are asked to adjudicate on matters relating to technology and climate?
Thank you, Raj, for that very long question, and I'll try to give a very short answer. But aloha to everybody. I am from Hawaii, and aloha means namaste in Hindi, and we would be privileged to have anybody from India to Hawaii for the reasons that I'll give in answer to this question. The idea of judges having the capacity to be able to make the decisions necessary to deal with this issue, I'll put in this context. There are two things to keep in mind: irreversibility and the concept of sharing. So don't forget, the role of the judge is a problem solver by duty. So if you find if there's a violation of the law, you have to provide a remedy. What's the remedy to climate change? One of the most prominent lawyers in India just spoke to us and monetized it. Ms. Pratibha Jain said $10 trillion. So judges are going to have to be making decisions at that level and with that understanding of the economy. Because as a thought experiment, can you imagine what it is that protects all of the economic enterprises and new ideas that we are talking about for the future? Whether you're talking about robotics, whether you're talking about artificial intelligence, whether you're talking about a new space industry, it's the rule of law. That's what would make it possible for $10 trillion to be used to be able to protect the citizens of Hawaii, because after all, that's what Ms. Jain was talking about. $10 trillion. Those issues come before judges. And there are two things that judges have before them in this issue that make it clearly there's a consensus among judges internationally. This is the most important issue facing judges: climate change. One of the concepts is irreversibility. Judges have to understand the science. You can argue as a member of civil society or a politician or a professor about the reality of the science, but when you're a judge, you have to come to the truth about it. And from that point of view, judges have to become familiar with the science. And there is definitely a group of experts internationally that supply that. The second thing I'll conclude by focusing on is the idea of sharing. There's an idea of justice. This is not a raw economic analysis of the men and women that are judges. They have to take into consideration fairness, social equity, pay attention to issues of the global south, for example, the disadvantaged. And that's the idea of sharing. Are we able to share now $10 trillion to India to be able to make it green? Are we able to share we have in the audience some extraordinary students from Jindal Global University called The Final Stand. They're making a final stand to say that the fair thing is to do something that is fundamental, transformational change for this sharing, so that, for example, we share the resources to protect the lungs of young people who have to experience a very, very high AQI. That comes before the court. And then the court has to decide, what do we do to protect young people if it means to some extent we have to do what the Prime Minister that you referred to, Prime Minister Sondheim, said. You have to be able to bring together ecology as well as the economy and do it in a fair way. And that could be a difficult thing in terms of achieving sharing of resources that ends up being decided by the courts.
Thank you. Thank you so much. May I move to Vesselin? Thank you, Michael, especially for highlighting the need for international rule of law to take precedence. Vesselin, we are, of course, at a very unique moment in history. Even after 2 world wars, and the last 75 years of a development of a strong international system of rules and regulations, there are genuine concerns that this is under serious threat. There have been cases more recently, but also somewhat historically, that there have been violations of the international rule of law. Now, today, at a time when we heard the previous session where almost every aspect of the global governance architecture, be it exploration of space or for that matter AI or technology, it is not only the state and its instrumentalities, but it is also the private sector. Private sector is going to have a very significant role. It already has. My question to you is that, how do we ensure that all these explorations, be it in the field of climate or technology, including AI or quantum or of course space, how do we ensure that this is based upon an international rule of law framework, that there ought to be powers that ought to be held accountable, be it whether it is state or non-state actors?
Thank you, Raj. I teach international law for almost 30 years, 28, and I never had such a difficult time. I see the skepticism in the eyes of my students when I enter the classroom, and I start my lecture on law of the United Nations, international law.
Speak a little louder, Vesselin. Yeah.
Because, as you mentioned, it is a very specific and difficult times when often we see violations of international law. Often people question the existence even of United Nations, of other global governance institutions, IMF, WTO, World Bank, WHO, and so on. So it is a difficult time for international law. However, I will kind of continue the passion of Judge Mike Wilson here and say, exactly because it is a difficult time, we need to reaffirm international law. International law doesn't disappear. It doesn't diminish itself because violations happen. Actually, exactly the opposite. Because violations happen, we need to be stronger and to reaffirm the belief and the implementation of international law. It's the same with criminal law. The fact is that crimes happen every day in every country. Do we dismiss the criminal law and criminal procedure? No, exactly the opposite. We need the criminal law and the criminal procedure exactly to prevent and punish crimes. In the same way, in international law, the fact that some states will violate international law doesn't make the law disappear. We need to repeat and to fight for the, as you said, for the norms, for the rules, and for the international rule of law, because otherwise we go back to the rule of the jungle. In fact, I started on my publication that we live in the 21st century with all the challenges of the 21st century. Our institutions are 20th century, 8 years old, but some leaders, unfortunately, act like in the 19th century. They go back to imperial vision and imperial policies. So really it's a time for leadership. We saw one this morning. We hope there are many more like this. And for that matter, I will continue to believe and to reaffirm that international law is the only way where all countries in the all people of the world will be equal, will be just, and will prosper.
Thank you so much, Vesselin. Well, we are running out of time. Let me be quick. Natasha, one of the things that we are facing today is also in the context of new areas of law that are emerging. You yourself did a lot of work on international trade law and international commercial law. The question that I have for you is that, to what extent we need to be conscious of the rights and freedoms of individuals as we embrace this idea of technology? We saw that AI and robotics and drones and all of this are moving at a pace where we hardly have time to deliberate and discuss the impact of these things on our values, be it values of democracy, but be it values of privacy or even ethics. So my question to you is that, what is it that we as lawyers, law professors, even lawmakers, some of them are present here, should be conscious of the fact, especially speaking from the global south standpoint, that how these technologies, we end up becoming literally swept away by the technologies, and in the process adding more problems to an already complex evolving society?
Thank you. So when we are looking at how the rapid advancement of technology, one thing we need to look at is ethical regulation. So we are having AI, we are having climate issues, but we need to ethically regulate AI. When we ethically regulate AI, this means that we are saying that we are not going to be accepting biased decision. We are not allowing discrimination to happen, because we are saying, even though AI is here to stay. So we are going to use AI, but we need to use it ethically, and also we need to regulate it so that we do not exacerbate the already vulnerable communities. On another issue, we need to balance national interest and economic sovereignty with international cooperation.
Yeah.
In as much as we are going to be developing, the national interests of our countries need to come first, and when they come first, we strengthen our laws, we strengthen enforcement mechanisms, and hopefully we will be able to catch up with the world.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for those really thoughtful remarks. And you're absolutely right that constantly we are under challenge between sovereignty and international rules, and how we need to balance those things. Over to you, Michael. Michael, you, of course, very passionately argued about the need for protecting the environment, but also addressing the issues of climate. One of the big challenges that we're facing in the context of climate change law is that many a time the actors who have involved in literally damaging the global climate standards are literally in the West, and have spent the last centuries doing that. And now we have the opportunity for the global South to pretty much trying to achieve, and we in India, the idea of a developed country. What is the kind of, let's say, balancing that you would recommend when it comes to use of law and regulation when we are addressing climate issues in India and BRICS countries, especially when they have aspirations to be able to achieve the developed status? What is the balancing act that we need to do?
Thank you, Raj. And I'll try to address this idea of what's the fair balance if you're talking about the kind of development that should be allowed the global South in terms of using up a carbon footprint when you compare it to what the carbon footprint is of the global North. In other words, there should be a kind of compensation to the global South. From a judge's point of view, whenever you hear balancing, although it's a nice concept like sustainability, there is a reality to whether you balance. Judges aren't allowed to balance sometimes. If it's a question of whether or not somebody is having their right violated, like the right to free speech, you can't balance that against the usefulness of taking against the right because it's going to help the economy, for example. We went through revolutions on that. Turning to climate change, irreversibility. This is the touchword for judges. We can't balance if it's an emergency. In the state of Hawaii, the earth can't heat up to 1.5 degrees under government policy. So if the government says we have to balance economic development against the idea of the earth heating up to 1.5 degrees, they're not allowed to. It's one of those rights that all the other rights depend upon. It's so fundamental in Hawaii because we'll have sea level rise, it'll destroy our economy in the extreme weather events. This is a decision to be made for each society. In India, how far India will go in moving it into an irreversible tipping point. What do I mean by irreversible? It's scientifically proven you can't go back. Once you create a problem so that the glaciers melt, the Ganges is gone. So how do you evaluate the value of that? That's what happens in court. Whether or not we should have the glaciers in the Himalayas is important in Hawaii, but it's not our value system. That's for the judges to decide along with the presentation of the attorneys. So I think it is a locally focused value system when it comes to these very fundamental rights like the right to a life-sustaining climate.
Thank you so much, and I'm going to move to Vesselin. We might have just got 4 minutes additional because we might have performed very well, so the organizers have been generous to add 4 minutes to our panel. Vesselin, I want to ask you about the fact that you talked a bit about institutions. You see, at the end of the day, some of these technologies are emerging, as it was mentioned in the course of today also, that the entire world is pretty much part of that innovation drive. Today, transformative technologies can emerge pretty much from anywhere in the world. At one level, we can be happy about the fact that we have democratized knowledge and innovation so that these type of innovations can happen anywhere. But the question is, and that's something which we need to ask, and I always ask this question, especially when we talk about liberal arts and humanities studies, science and technology will help us find the technology to make an atomic bomb. but it is the humanities which will help us understand whether we should use it on the first place or not. To me, law is humanities. So my question to you is that, how do we ensure that the legal framework is strong enough to withstand the innovations that are emerging in the field of technology without stopping them, yet recognizing the significant consequences of these technology on humankind, and to ensure that we are able to adapt to these technologies in a measured manner?
Excellent question. Rachan, you almost answered it exactly. We can look at, for example, can AI replace the judges? And if so, there won't be a dissenting opinion, because every robot will judge exactly the same. And dissenting opinions often are those drivers for future developments of law. In fact, I wrote it recently, this is the wisdom of the future day. So I see this as a human supervision over the technology always, that will make that synergy between the faster and stronger and mega data, but still with the human touch. So what we shouldn't worry about is to allow our students to use as much AI as they want, but to give a critical perspective on what the AI will answer to the questions we ask. So that creativity between humans and robots, I find as the best way to go ahead. And I see a lot of regulation already being proposed exactly in the same way.
All right, thank you. I'm completely out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Vesselin Popovski, Professor Natasha, Justice Michael Wilson. I do believe that the idea of next is so critical for every field, but especially for law, as law, I believe, is going to shape the future of several of these technologies that we discussed today, and the need for understanding and appreciating the impact of law and regulation is going to be a defining feature of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. All right, we're going to move on now. It's time to traverse and converse about the stock market. And as you know, the stock market is down right now, but that doesn't mean it's going to be down always.